All right, Grand Rising. Well, it's afternoon now, but let us continue on chapter 7 of Against the Apocalypse. Chapter 7 is Laughing Off the Trauma of History. But as they say, if it's fated to be a disaster, you lose your tongue. Shalom Aleichem, 1915. I talk, therefore I am, is a fitting motto for the Jews that people Shalom Aleichem's fictional universe. Even their silence speaks 1,000 words. In Shalom Aleichem's work, the Jews of Eastern Europe appear first and foremost as a speech community in which 3 or more languages are used simultaneously. Shalom Aleichem's wordplay depends entirely for its success upon a milieu sensitive to nuances in Yiddish, Hebrew, Ukrainian, Polish, Russian, German, and English. That in itself is culturally and historically unusual, especially because his audience, the audience that best appreciated his genius, was not a cultural elite, such as Christian clerics able to deal with Greek, Latin, and vernaculars, or similar priestly and academic mandarins, but the general population. The anomaly of this interplay of languages is much greater at a time of catastrophe, when we might anticipate obscenity, muteness, syntactic failure, neologism, and autistic repetition. We have instead a community of argumentative Jews, traveling salesmen, market women, upstanding householders, fathers, mothers, and sons, talking their way out of disaster in an orchestrated cacophony of voices. A systematic reading of Shalom Aleichem provides, perhaps uniquely, an appreciation for the textures of languages within a cycle of destruction. These textures, in turn, challenge the notion of any one language as the embodiment of truth, or of silence as the only adequate response to the abdication of truth. To begin with, the Jews of Eastern Europe considered both of their central languages the bearers of truth. Taking Hebrew in all its 19th century polyphony, its biblical, rabbinic, medieval, and masculine layers as the mythic vehicle, and Yiddish as the concurrent mythic commentary. Shalom Aleichem shows that the daily life of Eastern European Jews stood as commentary on biblical life. Just as for the revivalists, the late 18th century American Protestants, daily life became the illusion for the Bible. Their experience became the text. So Yiddish in the works of Shalom Aleichem does not allude to the original Hebrew, but informs it. Moreover, as Hebrew lost its prophetic or redemptive character, except for the Orthodox and the Zionists, Yiddish too was in danger of losing its mythic base. In response to this secularization process, Shalom Aleichem attempts through Yiddish to create a separate myth, a perfect linguistic medium that would shield the community from all the forces of history. Increasingly, cryptic language takes on a central role in the lives of his fictional Jews. There is a high cryptic style, all in Hebrew, used by the learned and semi-learned to send messages through the mail, and a low cryptic style used on the streets when there are policemen around. Since the police too can be expected to know a smattering of Yiddish, after all, they are invited every Friday night for Kalal and gefilte fish. Non-standard Hebraisms are used to talk over their heads to communicate coded messages in the language of Jewish learning. Both high and low cryptics are recognizably cryptic derivations of the central tongue, an ideal and idealized form of spoken Yiddish, which is as much the creation of Shalom Aleichem as his discovery. When compared to Yiddish folk locution in the raw, to the extent that such records have been preserved, Shalom Aleichem's version thereof is strikingly devoid of obscenity, especially the scatological kind, and uses Slavic and regional forms with great precision. The absence of really low language, which is the true index to the extreme liminal states into which the Jews were eventually put, for example, in the Nazi ghettos and camps, reveals what Shalom Aleichem is about. He is using language, a richly variegated form of Yiddish, to protect his characters from historical disruption. It is entirely likely that the common Jew also used language in this way, and that Shalom Aleichem, simply as if this were simple, exaggerated what he heard. What is even more likely is that Shalom Aleichem wanted to resurrect a failing Yiddish, one that was polluted, too Hebraized, Germanized, and Slavicized, too vulgar or too flat, as a way of maintaining Jewish inviolability. He lived just long enough to see his art of the incongruous tested to the limit. His his was a com his was a comic paradigm that could be followed by very few, because so few could sustain a vision of human inviolability. Against a historical field of disarray and destruction, his characters use their colloquial speech as a protective shield. Working against the resilience of language was history, a permanent vehicle of destruction. History was relentless and inscrutable, to the extent that the old world characters were people of faith, such as Tavie the comic Job, or Reb Yusufel, the Shlemiel rabbi of Kazrelk. They could still accommodate history to a divine scheme, but the moment a character was thrust into the contemporary world, Menachem Mendel, the jack of all modern trades, or any of the travelers in a third class train compartment. They experienced a world in which miracles, if they happened at all, were a result of human error, not of divine will. Tevye, in the end, was forced to pack up and leave his village, and even Reb Yosefil died without benefit of the old age home he had fought for so bravely. Shalom Aleichem began his Yiddish career shortly after the first series of Tsarist pogroms in 1881 through 82. Whether for reasons of external or internal censorship, or because his youthful enthusiasm compensated for the trauma of history, the pogroms did not figure directly in his early writings. He was certainly not alone here, for the pogrom shitchik hardly appeared at all in Yiddish and Hebrew fiction until the Kishinev pogrom. Shalom Aleichem's optimism in this period derived from his faith in a Jewish liberal alliance in Tsarist Russia, the dream that Moses Mendelssohn had been the first to espouse. This faith was not shaken by the Kishinev pogrom. Unlike some Jewish intellectuals who despaired once and for all of the Russian liberal sector, Shalom Aleichem initiated a project designed not only to raise funds for the pogrom victims, but also to mobilize support from within Russian society. To these ends, he published Hilf, or Aid, subtitled An Almanac for Literature and Art, which was, from an aesthetic point of view at least, the most impressive Yiddish publication of its time. In addition to the work of major Yiddish and Hebrew writers, it contained three parables by Tolstoy, written especially for the volume, and a story by Vladimir Korolenko, all in authorized translations by Shalom Aleichem. Obviously, the censor was especially zealous. David Penske's realistic drama, The Zvi Family, was expunged altogether, and Korolenko was represented by a rather sentimental story, in marked contrast to the stark eyewitness account of the Kishinev massacre, which circulated underground. In line with these constraints and with his optimistic agenda, Shalom Aleichem's own contribution to the volume focused on peripheral phenomena, on the petty rivalries fueled by the arbitrary rule of the Tsar. 101 was a fairly benign example of how, under tyrannical rule, the comic results from the fact that all normal laws are suspended and the arbitrary reigns. Within such a world of arbitrary rule, the language of intervention can never work to one's benefit, either because cultural differences are exacerbated or because one branch of government can overturn the decision of another. What happens here is that administrative fiat severs the bond of two neighboring towns, Bohopoil and Holt, under the temporary rules of the 3rd of May of 1882. Henceforth, Holt is decreed a village where the presence of Jews is no longer desirable because they supposedly corrupt the morals of the peasants. Thus, no Jews are allowed to settle there anew. But since Holt is the more prosperous place, the inhabitants of neighboring Bohopoil will do anything in their power to steal across. With the local police waiting to turn them back at the bridge, Jews must meet the challenge with special rhetorical skills and with a working knowledge of Ukrainian. How can that be, he argued. I've lived in Holt for many years. I have my own city and the school. I have my several relatives in the cemetery. But the entreaties were as efficacious as yesterday's snow. The Jewish claim to ownership is so spiritual and otherworldly and is expressed in terms that are so culturally specific. Having a city and the school means owning a seat in the house of study, that rendering them into another language, even that of the native peasantry, only heightens the Jews' vulnerability. Their manipulation of various codes will be an index to the way in which Shalom Aleichem's characters negotiate the perilous terrain of history. Government intervention does not fare much better than face-to-face negotiations with the local police. After years of personal anguish and animosity, Yerechmiel Moshe's case is finally taken up by the Russian Senate, which allows him to return home to Holt across the bridge. But the victory over his arch-rival, Nachman Leib, proves utterly meaningless when, at exactly the same time, the Tsar revokes the temporary rules as symbolic restitution for the excesses of Kishinev. As of the 10th of May, 1903, 101 localities that had previously been barred to Jews are opened up for free domicile, and Holt, of course, is on the list. Yerachmiel Moshe, we are to understand from the story's finale, goes mad and remains in Bohopoil, while Nachman Leib is the one to make the coveted move. And so, for Shalom Aleichem, the meaning of Kishinev was that Jews would continue to be the butt of diabolical Tsarist jokes, though perhaps mutual aid and cooperation across cultural barriers, far more formidable than those between Bohopoil and Holt, could soften the blow. Help came in small doses in a crazy world bent on destruction. As towns Holt and Bohopoil could be shuffled around with impunity, just like their hapless inhabitants. As fictional settings, they were accordingly indistinguishable, all the more so in the revised version of the story. Their fate was too tied in with the grimmer aspects of Sar's fiat to make for a timeless work of fiction. Immortality, though, was already on its way in the form of Khazra-Lef, the town of little people. It was many years in the making before it emerged as Shalom Alechem's shorthand for Jewish collective survival and exile. In his stories about this town, Shalom Alechem mined the most popular of Yiddish folk motifs, the fool's town of Kelm, as well as the core of masculine satire, to produce a normative community of such faith and language that it could transform defeat into victory. The finest episodes in the Khazra-Lef cycle are deceptively simple. They use well-worn plots and a gallery of recognizable types. As these stories were serialized in Russian Yiddish press, readers grew familiar with the stock characters. Fischl, the correspondent, Zadel Reb Shays, the only man in town who subscribes to a newspaper, and a Hebrew one at that, Reb Yusufel, the rabbi, and pardon the proximity, the town's 2 or 3 domesticated goyim. Many plots were lifted straight out of folklore and 19th century satire, sometimes with a title that revealed the probable source. Thus, when Shalom Alechem in 1904 published one of his longest Khazra-Lef narratives, The Great Panic of the Little People, the word behole, B-E-H-O-L-E, in the title invoked a 40-year tradition of spoofs on shtetl hysteria. Shalom Alechem followed the standard 3-part plot of these works. 1, the arrival of news from the outside world sends the isolated shtetl into a state of panic. 2, all normal activity stops as the entire shtetl prepares feverishly for the imminent event. 3, when the truth is finally revealed, everyone is disappointed, duped, or disgraced. The same pattern could be used for any number of stories because the anticipation of destruction was structurally parallel to the anticipation of salvation. So long as the shtetl was viewed as a provincial backwater fanatically resistant to the changes that enlighteners or the Tsar had designed for its own benefit, the shtetl Jews could do no right, and their every reaction was an overreaction. But once the Enlighteners grew disenchanted with their government's intentions, they came to view the shtetl's resistance as a quixotic struggle against malevolent forces. Straddling the two positions in 1890, Shalom Alechem could joke about the shtetl running scared over a blood libel that didn't come to pass, but he also concluded with a stern warning not to take anti-Semitism too lightly. 14 years later, with Kishinev a reality, Shalom Alechem began to see the shtetl's prime act of resistance as rhetorical. In The Great Panic, Khazra-Lef gets word of the pogrom by means of a letter, written in ornate and cliched Hebrew and addressed to a ritual slaughterer from his semi-learned son-in-law. With trembling hands and quaking knees do I write these words to you. Know that the weather here has undergone a severe change. No pen can possibly describe it. Chapter 2. A direct, terse, and unambiguous message in plain Yiddish would have conveyed the imminent threat of a knowable danger. A string of fixed phrases and circumlocutions makes the event at once more ominous and less so. For as the narrator, a native son himself, informs us, sages and savants have long noted that the Jews are incomparable at the art of reading between the lines, and as the son in law's letter passes from hand to hand, each male reader adds his own terrifying interpretation to the coded lines. On the other hand, the son in law might have gotten carried away with his own eloquence, as so often happens to this type of semi-learned correspondent. Indeed, the inhabitants of Kasrelef swapped jokes at his expense, trying in this manner to dispel the gloom, until Zadel, the sole subscriber to the Hebrew paper Hazifra, corroborates the news, and they are duly thunderstruck. The letter illustrates the high cryptic style, or at least a faint echo, of the original flowery Hebrew as rendered by the author into Prost Zargon, or plain Yiddish, and as translated into English. Jews would find this funny because they would recognize the discrepancy between the profanity of the times and the biblicism of the language, whereas we readers, whoever we are, should realize that Shalom Aleichem is trying to play with language in such a way that events change as the language in which they are reported changes. Within the narrative frame of a pogrom scare, Shalom Aleichem provides us with an anatomy of Jewish language, a compendium of speech patterns from the cradle to the grave in the home, marketplace, and houses of prayer. Perhaps this is what he meant to signify when he subtitled the work a poema, a Russian loan word for a long narrative poem. Language, as we shall see, becomes part of a lyrical statement. From early childhood, the Kazrolevker learns that the world is divided into Gentiles and Jews. In answer to the Gentile children's taunts, their tattle mammal, daddy and mommy, in imitation of Yiddish speech, and the pigs' ears they form with the corners of their jackets, Jewish children respond in kind with a well-rehearsed rhyme. Kishka cooks in our pots, for me a bread, you drop dead, for me a wagon, for you a hearse, pant and rave, dig your grave. Even at this early stage, life in the shtetl bears out the meaning of the biblical passages they learn in Heder. When young Makar Kolodny, the cold one, beats them up for singing this ditty, they learn the true meaning of the passage. The voice is the voice of Jacob, yet the hands are the hands of Esau. Genesis 27 and 22. And when a band of Gentiles gangs up on them, they understand the plight of the Israelites fleeing from the Philistines in chapter 4. As the Kazrelivker Jews and Gentiles grow up, the language of mutual abuse loses its innocence. Thanks to a little church learning, Makar, apparently modeled on a real-life anti-Semite from Shalom Aleichem's childhood, rises in the municipal hierarchy and knows enough to call the Jews by their generic names, Itzka, Berka, and to taunt them with their favorite words, Ive, Shabs, Kugel. They in turn address him with mock respect in High Goyish or Russian instead of Low Goyish Ukrainian. In the tavern, store, and market, the divisions become even more pronounced because there the Jew is in control. And with strategically placed Hebrew words, he can ensure his economic and moral superiority. Can one possibly explain, wonders the narrator with tongue in cheek at the very end of the story, why it is that a Kazraviker Jew will throw in all the Hebrew he's ever learned the moment he starts talking about a non-Jew. This super Hebraized form of Yiddish, which I have dubbed the low cryptic style, is a legitimate defense in time of danger, but in normal business dealings, it represents unfair advantage. Place a beaker of vintage into the hands of the uncircumcised one, says the Jewish tavern keeper to his Jewish help, but don't exceed the brim and a slice of the staff of life, for he hasn't partaken of nourishment all day, and charge him to silver pieces and bid him sally forth, but scrutinize him that he doesn't appropriate a thing. All the key words here set apart by diction and capitalization are non-standard Hebraisms that the poor peasant would never have heard in spoken Yiddish. Economic advantage makes the Jew so self-confident that he abuses his non-Jewish customer to his face in a Hebrew, Yiddish, Slavic argot. Please don't take it amiss, my lord, says the Jewish storekeeper in Ukrainian. Shalom babayis maskin bakashin, which means when the promissory note, Hebrew, Yiddish, mashkin, is safe in my pocket, Yiddish, keshin, there will be peace between us. Hebrew, shalom babayis, in chapter 8. These are the words of Mordecai Nasson, the merchant and community masher wheeler dealer. He is portrayed by Shalom Aleichem in a rare instance of Marxist caricature as a boor and a sycophant, the worst that the shtetl Burgess has produced. The market, therefore, is seen as a breeding ground of animosity and its language as the language of deceit and distrust. In the home, the relations between Jews and Gentiles are altogether different. The goy for the Sabbath knows well and good that what they eat, he, Kevdor, can also eat, but what he, Kevdor, eats, they are forbidden to eat. Chapter 3. He asks no questions, just goes about his business, blowing out the Sabbath candles and carrying a prayer book to the synagogue. Actions his employers must abstain from on the holy days. Except when drunk, Kevdor is docile and obedient, and on those occasions when he does go overboard, the Yiddish Slavic curses heaped upon him by the Jews put him in his place. Thus, communication with Kevdor reflects his partial integration into Jewish life. It consists mostly of commands, curses, and key words like shaves or Shabbos, Sabbath, bok, meaning roll, kazer, meaning pig, and kapor, meaning scapegoat. Hapke, the maid, represents the total integration of Gentiles into shtetl society, behaviorally and linguistically. Hapke speaks Yiddish like a Jew. Her speech is peppered with a profusion of mispronounced Hebrew words like merchin, meaning God willing, naktis, all right, kenor nicht, no evil eye, losat, for noun, lavdol, to differentiate between the sacred and profane, gutiont, good holiday, mak rainvaser, water for ablution, and many more. And when Kevdor's back is turned, she can think of no better appellation than Kapornik, good for nothing. Sounds like Kaepernick. So great is the shtetl's love for Hapke and its absolute reliance upon her services that it saves her good name after Makar seduces her. This is not easy for Kazrilek to do, for it means foregoing the pleasure of taking revenge upon its long-standing enemy. Whereas the home can provide a setting of perfect integration between Gentiles and Jews, the house of prayer can be turned into the scene of bitter rivalries between Jews and other Jews. A legacy of religious schisms has left at least one vestige in the order of prayer. The Jews of Khazralev, following Hasidic practice, recite Hoidu, meaning give thanks to the Lord, before Baruch Sheomar, blessed be he who spoke, in the morning service, whereas the Jews of neighboring Kozodoyev retain the pre-Hasidic order of the Misnagdim, chapter 14. Lest we think this verbal one-upmanship is but a quirk or a historical curiosity, the narrator has assured us earlier that speech and wordplay are the Khazrelkers' main arsenal of attack and self-defense. As is well known throughout the world, a Khazralker will stop at nothing for the sake of one good jibe. He will walk for miles, risk his livelihood and even his life. Chapter 5. Nothing can douse the verbal fireworks, not his fear of the goyim or even his fear of God. Only the cemetery and bathhouse remain untouched by strife, for they are the mythic centers of the town. Unlike the market, a place of corruption and monopoly, and unlike the synagogue, where street animosities permeate as well. Part of Khazralev exists in ecological balance. Since the old Jewish cemetery is the only grazing area in town, it feeds the Jewish goats, who in turn provide Jewish children with their much needed milk. And part, the bathhouse, exists in a state of nature. Adam and Eve, the bathhouse attendants, live in perfect innocence. Virgins, the rabbi calls them kinderlech or children. They go around naked most of the time, sleep out of doors, and commune with the frogs in summer. Not surprisingly, the bathhouse is the locus of a special Adamic language, and Adam rises very early, when God himself still slumbers, and with his healthy pair of arms, he draws pail after pail of water, belting out by heart whole chunks of psalms with a melody, and his voice sounds and resounds. You can hear it from inside the bathhouse, and it carries with the wind over the banks of the river and is lost somewhere far off in the distance, in chapter 11. Living with the bathhouse attendants on the premises is the aged Reb Yusufel, whom the community has entrusted to their care. He is a pure soul and a broken vessel, a pathetic Job who justifies God's ways with a parable for every occasion. His is a language of faith, though the only ones he can still move with his piety are Adam and Eve. In their whole lives, they never heard so many words of Torah as they now heard in a single day from the old Rabbi Reb Yusufel. And everything they heard was new to them. In their eyes, he was like a traveler from distant lands who told exotic tales which defied the imagination. Winter and summer, they heard the rabbi talk on matters of the spirit, telling them the wonders of the Lord, of men in this world and angels in the world to come, of the earth and all its creatures, of the heaven, sun and moon, the stars and all the galaxies. Chapter 12. Thus, the bathhouse is the locus of language in its purest form, a language of perfect faith and harmony, a language upon which and through which the Jews of Khazralev should be able to maintain their psychological and social balance, a language which is their ultimate resort and ultimate resource. But this is a language that is too isolated from the forces of history, which can now penetrate the borders of the town through rumors and lies spread by means of cryptic Hebrew letters, and anti-Semitic Russian newspapers. Makar Kolodny, now a ranking official in the town administration, has access to one such paper through which he learns about the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the most recent case of Jews baking matzo with Christian blood. Interesting. When he questions Mordecai Nasson on the matter, it is enough to drive even this obsequious, power-hungry merchant into a fit of rage. Makar is thereby convinced that the accusations are true. All this adds to Khazralev's panic until one fine day the whole town packs up and runs. Reb Yusufal alone stands fast. Hearken and know, he says to Adam and Eve, that the guardian of Israel doth not slumber or sleep. Let me tell you a parable about a king, chapter 13. Though absolute, his faith is ineffectual. By sheer coincidence, not by virtue of the inhabitants' faith or creativity, it is Khazralev's language more acerbic, argumentative, and cryptic than Reb Yusufal's that more directly weathers the storm. Whom should the townspeople meet on the road but their traditional enemy, the people of the neighboring town of Kosodoyev? Confronted with a comedy of errors, each town having sought refuge from the imagined pogrom in the other town. The two Shtetlek are reconciled to each other by talking through their fright and embarrassment, and they talked away, talked themselves full as a barrel, and talked their hearts out. Then they shook hands, took leave of each other nicely, and embraced. Chapter 14. Nothing has really been solved. The faith of mythic Khazralev wins only by default over the fear of mercantile Khazralev, and the existence of two Khazralevs points to dangers ahead. For as the shtetl falls apart, its central tongue also seems to do so, creating a possibly unbridgeable gap between faith and pragmatism. However delighted we may be to see the neighboring towns make up their old differences, it is not they who are endangering each other, but an enemy lurking on the outside and its agents working from within. In the face of real danger, all speech may become ironic and cryptic, at which point comes loss of community and the resultant terror, hysteria, and anarchy, or at the opposite extreme, Reb Yusufal's brand of transcendental faith divorced from any social context. And real danger does in fact lurk on the horizon. For many, Kishinev shattered hopes that a new enlightened era would be ushered in by the 20th century. For Shalom Aleichem, the faith in political reform lingered on until the revolution of February 1905, until, that is, there came a cycle of military pogroms, more brutal and widespread than before. Shalom Aleichem lived through the 1905 pogrom in Kiev, and almost as the atrocities were unfolding, he recorded the events in his own city and throughout the Pale for the American Yiddish press. Brothers, did you once weep over the Kishinev disaster? Forget it. Listen instead to what happened in Naishin. Jews, throw out your old laments. Cry for Odessa. With the pogroms came exile. Shalom Aleichem left Russia by train at the end of 1905 and never returned except on tour. From Abram Abish, Shalom Aleichem learned that the third-class train compartment could serve as symbolic shorthand for the plight of exile. All those Jews en route to nowhere, crammed into a few filthy cars and telling tales along the way. But Shalom Aleichem's train tales, written mostly in 1909 and 1910, when the author suffered a near-fatal attack of tuberculosis, made Mendel's train ride of 1890 seem like a field trip. An anonymous traveling salesman presents Tales of Insanity, blind ambition, reckless gambling, white slave trade, apostasy and self hate, pogroms, and anti Semitism. Each train provides a different setting for the telling of a tale. On a busy commuter train, the story may begin and end abruptly, in accordance with the storyteller's schedule. Of all the trains that travel the Jewish route, the straggler special, Der Ledigier, whatever, is the one most conducive to traditional long drawn out stories, because just as you can wait on the platform and go crazy with boredom until the interminable ritual of switching and fueling the train is completed by a band of inebriated goyim, once on board, you have the rare privilege of stretching out, as in your father's vineyard, and of sharing in a story. Seldom do more than two passengers travel in a car at any one time on the Straggler Special. The kind of story that this train inspires has much to do, in fact, with its sudden stops and starts, its long periods of repetition, its infrequent runs, and its unpredictable schedule. The Straggler Special, in short, becomes the hero of a miracle tale for the age of technology. Judging from its title, A Kassin on Klezmer, A Wedding Without Musicians, promises at worst to be a domestic tragedy, unless Kassin is to be construed in its patriarchal slang meaning of misfortune. Indeed, in the spirited narration that follows, every upbeat statement is qualified to mean its opposite. First, the tale is introduced in mock storybook fashion. Vayahe Mbeyame, this took place. Heaven help us. Ha Constitutie, during the days of Constitution. That is to say, when the salvations for the Jews began. Though I must tell you that we Jews of Hyson have never been afraid of pogroms. Why weren't you afraid? Simply because there was no one in our town to beat us up. Not that the addressee, the worldly traveling salesman, and by extension each one of us, would be taken in by such a ridiculous boast. Of course, you can imagine that if we looked very hard, we could find one or two volunteers who wouldn't deny themselves the pleasure of ventilating us a little, that is to say, breaking our bones. Even so, for a real pogrom to take place, the hooligans would have to be imported by an embittered Polish nobility. For the proof is, when the good news began drifting in from all sides, the few scoundrel squires in our parts sent off confidential letters to the proper places, saying, whereas it would be a good idea if something were done in Hyacinth also, but since there is no one here to do it, would they be so kind as to send help? In other words, would they please dispatch some people as quickly as possible? The more imminent the danger, the more the narrator tries to explain it away. Now, the cast of characters takes its place. Noah Tonkanog, the bearer of bad tidings, and Nachman Kasoy, the man with connections. At each step in the drama, it is Noah who carries the news in strictest confidence to every person in town. And that is how the whole town learns of the detailed plan for disposing of the Jews. The hooligans will be arriving by train, and their approach is heralded by telegrams. It is worth pausing for a moment, as Shalom Aleichem would do when he has us sitting on the edge of our seats, to recall that ever since the 1880s, the trains had played a cataclysmic role in the SARS pogroms. Most of the pogromists of 1881 through 82 were itinerant workers drawn from the recently liberated serfs who had left their villages to work and live near the train stations, and were easily organized to raise hell along the route, lest our own visual images of cattle cars crowd out the terror that Shalom Aleichem's readers must have felt in their day. We should note that the train was already being transformed in his fiction from a source of dislocation to a vehicle of death. The Jews of Hyson marshaled their scant resources against the coming onslaught of muscle and machine. The narrator here interjects his own words of sober pragmatism, which may very well reflect Shalom Aleichem's growing skepticism since the days of Hilf. He too once believed in the goodwill of the peasants and the compassion of the liberal intelligentsia. I was the only one in town who wasn't anxious to hide. I am not boasting about my bravery, but this is the way I see it. What's the sense of being afraid of a pogrom? I don't say that I am a hero. I might have been willing to hide too when the hour of reckoning came. But I asked myself first, how can I be sure that during the slaughter, the friendly peasant in whose cellar I was hiding, or the notary, or the director of the factory himself wouldn't? You understand? And all that aside, how can you leave a town wide open like that? It's no trick to run away. You have to see about doing something. The course of action they hit upon, buying protection from the police inspector through the mediation of Nachman the contractor, is ironically undercut by idiomatic expressions that suggest the fatal inevitability of making such desperate choices. The Russian inspector is referred to as a poritz, Polish squire, and Nachman is reduced to delivering a handsome bribe like a medieval court Jew. The inspector accepts the bribe and assures them that all will be well. But when Noah announces the hooligans' impending arrival, the hopes and fears of Hyson begin fluctuating wildly at each new turn of events. In the up and down pattern so characteristic of Shalom Aleichem's work as a whole, the inspector sends for the Cossacks. When we heard this, we breathed more easily. When a Jew hears that a Cossack is coming, he takes courage. He can face the world again. Literally, he shows the world a fig. The question remained, who would arrive first? The Cossacks from Tulchin or the band of hooligans from Zmarinko? Common sense told us that the hooligans would arrive first because they were coming by train, while the Cossacks were coming on horseback. The time-tested methods, it seems, have not kept pace with technology. Leaving aside for now the historical irony of Cossacks as saviors of the Jew, the immediate issue is whether God will perform a miracle and whether the straggler special, true to form, will be delayed. But this one time it looked as though a miracle wouldn't take place. The straggler kept going from station to station as regular as a clock. One can hardly resist the temptation to retell the whole story, if only to convey Shalom Aleichem's brilliant manipulation of suspense and the reader's cathartic laughter when the train finally pulls in without the cars. Not God, but human error has intervened. At the last station, the hooligans have gotten drunk, drawing the crew in with them, and the uncoupled locomotive has left them all behind. By the time they arrive on foot, the Cossacks have had ample time to get there first, and the Uksamim Beodem mit de Kanchiks in the hint, that is, with whips in their hands, the Cossacks disperse the rabble. A more iconic gloss on the story than this Hebrew Yiddish wordplay can hardly be imagined. When the elders of Moab and Midian came to Balaam with Balak's message to curse the tribes of Israel, they set out Uxamim Baaldem with divination in their hand. Numbers 22:7. Beyond the incongruity of translating somim, a word denoting magic, by the Slavic word kanchiks or whips, lies a haunting analog. To be rescued from a pogrom by Cossacks' whips is not unlike being caught between Balak's curse and Balaam's equivocation. Notice how the narrator of this story, the traveling salesman from Hyson, has recast the entire experience into a playful, ironic, and elusive language that presupposes a listener reader who is as well versed in Jewish rhetoric and Jewish affairs as he is himself. In this respect, he is a much more effective narrator for a tale of modern terror than Shalom Aleichem, who waxed too lyrical, was too judgmental, and therefore was too intrusive in his poema of The Great Panic. Notice too that a wedding without musicians is also resolved by mere chance. Miracle and proof text notwithstanding, the aborted pogrom was the closest call yet, closer by far than the private rage that 101 randomly shuffled boundaries could provoke, or the panic that false news unleashes in a traditional society. Now the signals are coming in loud and clear, and the margin of error grows narrower by the moment. During these years of growing danger to the Jews of Eastern Europe, Shalom Aleichem was perfecting three different narrators who maintained their essential character over 2 decades of new installments. Each member of this celebrated triumvirate used a different kind of synthetic language to mediate the tremors of history. Model, the son of Pace, the cantor, is the living embodiment of adaptability and freedom. His chief linguistic trait is the literalism of a child. I can't make out what stealing the border means, he says as the family prepares to steal across the Russian border into Austria Hungary. Are we some kind of thieves? Other children his age, like Koppel the immigrant, whom he meets in a way station in Krakow, know much more about current events than Model. What's this about a pogrom? I ask him. I keep on hearing the immigrants talk about pogrom, but I can't make out what it is. So Koppel says to me, you mean you don't know what a pogrom is? Are you a ninny? A pogrom is something you can find everywhere. At the beginning, it's next to nothing, but once it starts, it can last for 3 days. I don't get it. I say, is it some kind of bear? Wanting Model to be the epitome of freedom and optimism, Shalom Aleichem later regretted burdening him with the subject of pogroms. Tayev, on the other hand, cannot escape the hot pursuit of history simply because history, usually in the guise of a prospective son in law, pursues him to his doorstep. All the personal tragedies that befall Tevier, ranging from bad business investments to his daughter Sprinx's suicide, he is able to withstand like a proud oak in the forest. It is by no means the tragic, if conventional plot, however, that marks Tevier as Shalom Aleichem's greatest character, but the language that Tevier employs in retelling his Job-like saga. For Tevier, as Ruth Wiss points out, is the most trustworthy of Shalom Aleichem's speakers, the one in whom all levels of the Yiddish language come into play, high and low, old and new, indigenous and imported. Unlike Reb Yusufel, whose language is too pure and otherworldly, and unlike many of the third-class train passengers whose language is too corrupt, Tevier achieves a perfect balance between all components of the language, his special brilliance showing through in an ironic language of faith that fuses biblical and liturgical snippets with everyday concrete reality. It is Tevye's language, above all, that is the ultimate resort and ultimate resource of the Jewish people in extremis, and the language of which all other Jewish dialects are a cryptic derivation. When history finally catches up with Tevye, he can talk his way out of expulsion from the village, though in an alternate ending to the book, Shalom Aleichem did have him banished. Tevye's is the language of tradition in most fully recognized form, a language deeply rooted in Torah, folk wisdom, and pragmatism, a language that Shalom Aleichem believed could withstand any challenge the Jewish people would face. If, in the best of Shalom Aleichem's work, the mode of talking about life sets up a pattern of acting it out, then Menachem Mendel and his wife, Shane Schindel, represent the two most extreme cases of a fixed linguistic form versus an ever changing reality. In the second series of letters between them, written in 1913 and only recently reissued in book form, Menachem Mendel is reincarnated as, of all things, a Yiddish journalist in Warsaw. As in prior metamorphoses, Menachem Mendel absorbs the technical vocabulary of every new development with extraordinary ease and numerous malapropisms. Some have called him a grown-up model, while his cantankerous wife remains equally true to form. What is different in Book 2, however, is that history now encroaches more directly on her life, though she never sets foot outside Kasralev. Shin Schindel reports back to him on the refugees from the neighboring villages, on one family whose male members perish while hiding from the police, and another family that commits suicide rather than die of starvation. The formulaic pattern is always the same. To my dear, esteemed, renowned, and honored husband, the wise and learned Menachem Mendel, may his light shine forever. In the first place, I want to tell you that we are all, praise the Lord, perfectly well, and may we hear the same from you, please God, and never anything worse. In the second place, I am writing to say, my dearest husband, that God came down on our Kasralev as he's never done before. In the second place, what follows is a pitiless, garrulous, anything but pious account of the Kortovoy family. Moshe Nachman, his contemptible second wife, some widowed butcher's wife, and his brother Burl Isaac, their sole means of support. Expelled from his village, the prosperous brother is too proud to seek help from his impoverished brother in Kasralev. When even immigration to America fails for lack of funds, Burl Isaac plans his suicide pact. Shin Schindel interrupts the story to ask about all the millions of dollars her husband had mentioned for the resettlement of Eastern European Jews. Don't they know, she continues, invoking her inviolable authority, what mother keeps saying? As Meshech Vetkumen Vetmin ze Bardafen a Kapors. When the Messiah comes, there'll be no good to anyone. In short, things were really bad. What was there to do? Well, listen to what a Kortovoy can pull. So he decides, Burl Isaac, that is, to talk the matter over with his wife. What's the point, he says, when there's no way to make a living and no money to make a move to America, and dying is something you have to do anyway. So rather than die of hunger, why not take poison while you're still alive? He said it once, twice, 3 times. His wife probably burst into tears and pointed to the children as if to say, what'll happen to the children? So he says, Burl Isaac, That is, we'll poison the children first, then we'll also drink the stuff. How do you like that for a crazy Jewish idea? Only a Corto boy could come up with that one. Burl Isaac, or Isaac, is no more to blame for his plight than the Jewish relief agencies, which are slow to mobilize their funds. Yet Shan Schindel's indignation is not as wildly off the mark as it might seem. Though she cannot offer global solutions as her husband can, neither can she accept Burl Isaac's way of coping with adversity. Buttressed by her mother's fatalism, Shane Schindel stands fast in her life affirming practicality. Like all of Shalom Aleichen's archetypal characters, this odd couple will never change, regardless of what goes on around them. Nothing will shake Menachem Mendel's fantasy life when, at the end of his adventures, he is sent to Kiev on assignment to cover the trial of Mendel Bielis. Accused of ritual murder in 1913, he contrives to put even this act of barbarism to good advantage. Once the trial is over, he plans to be the agent of Bielis's American tour. Thus, for the Menachem Mendel, there will always be new words to be mustered and mastered, for he perceives life as an endless source of opportunity, while Shane Schindel's speech, proverb-ridden, acerbic, and hyper-provincial, is the surest sign that all of life is a state of siege in which only the home can offer protection. Okay, I'm going to leave it there on page 178, and we will finish up when I return. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Love you all. Peace.